Like a lot of journalists in the mid-2000s, Tim Burrowes grew frustrated with his employer's print mentality and its tendency to treat online publishing as an afterthought. At the time, he worked for an Australian trade magazine that covered the country's media industry. So in 2008, he and two co-founders decided to launch Mumbrella, a competing blog that published upwards of 15 times a day. Its gossipy comments section quickly attracted an audience of bored office workers, and within a few years it was hosting multiple industry events that collectively generated millions of dollars. In a recent interview, Tim explained how Mumbrella made such a big splash so quickly, why he and his co-founders decided to sell it, and what he's doing differently with his newest media startup. Hello, I'm Simon Owens, and this is The Business of Content, the show about how publishers create, distribute, and monetize their digital content. If you want to listen to an audio version of this show, subscribe to The Business of Content wherever you get your podcasts. By the way, have you ever wondered how I monetize this show? It's entirely reliant on subscriptions to my Substack newsletter. When you subscribe, you're able to book a half-hour introductory phone call with me. You also receive subscriber-only interviews with some of the world's most successful media entrepreneurs. Support the work I do here by subscribing at simonowens.substack.com. That's simonowens.substack.com. Or just Google the words Simon Owens and newsletter. And finally, if you're on the lookout for interviews with the world's most successful media entrepreneurs about how they built their businesses, then this is the show for you. So take a few moments to hit the subscribe button down below. Okay, let's jump into the interview. Hey Tim, thanks for joining us.
Hey, an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for the invitation. Long-time listener, first-time caller.
That's great. Well, we're here to talk about two media brands that you have launched and run yourself. Before that, before you launched your first company, which is called Mumbrella, which we'll get to talking about, what was your background in journalism?
Yeah, I suppose like increasingly few people, I came up through newspapers. So first in the UK, the first 7 or 8 years, working on various kind of regional and local newspapers of just about every frequency, from weekly through to multi-edition daily. And then gradually I kind of sort of diverted into sort of more specialist media. So I ended up as...
For the newspapers you worked for, it was like local beat reporting kind of stuff?
Yeah, correct. Yeah, so absolutely classic local newspapers where, you would be covering the local council meeting, you'd be going to, visit the ambulance station every day, talk to the fireys, all of that sort of thing, and then sort of gradually move to kind of, busier, more kind of, regional newspapers that were, but again, were, broadly kind of local. So that I suppose I used to think of as the first third of my career, but being realistic, it's probably the first 15% or 20% now, as I've sort of left it behind. But then I moved more into kind of specialist media. So did a number of years on a title writing about for hospital doctors in the UK, and sort of I guess honed my editing skills there. And then the transferable part of my skills, when I began to write about media and marketing, was when I became editor of Media Week in the UK, which again, I guess I was at that point hired for my editing skills rather than my industry knowledge, which then developed along the way.
Mm-hmm. So you were in like traditional newspapers in the 90s, right? So it was kind of mainly print type of reporting, and is that correct?
1989. I came in just in time to be trained on a manual typewriter. I remember the excitement when the fax machine got installed in the office. So I've been through a couple of technology cycles of things that came along and faded as well. But yeah, so my sort of heyday in kind of as a newspaper journo was the 90s. So by the time
and then you got into like B2B specialist media in like the early 2000s.
Yeah, so my first B2B specialist job was a hospital doctor, which was 1996, if I recall correctly. So that was my sort of entree, and then I've been writing about and kind of working in that media and marketing beat since 2002. So frighteningly enough, I guess if I do the maths, that's more than 2 decades now.
Yeah. So this was like a B2B publication that was read by people who worked at, early 2000s marketing agency, like almost like an Ad Age, an Ad Week, or something like that in the US.
Yeah, that's right. So the centre of gravity for Media Week in the UK was about the business side of media. So it would have been read by predominantly by people in media agencies or people working in media sales on the media owner side of things, which I suppose when I look back now became quite a good sort of education for when you want to run a business yourself.
Yeah. So how did you end up moving to Australia?
Yeah, so via the Middle East, I ended up as the launch editor of Campaign Middle East, which was a franchise from Haymarket's original campaign title in the UK. So
And what was that? What did they
so
cover?
yeah, so that was read by anyone involved in the communications industry. So still media, but also marketing as well. People working in advertising agencies, people involved in the creation of content, and that was for the whole region.
Specifically, people who worked for marketing agencies in the Middle East.
Yeah, that's correct. Or people working in the creation of media, the creation of making advertising. So our center of gravity was Dubai, but you probably had three real hubs. You had at that point. Saudi Arabia was the biggest consumer audience, so you had some people present there. But a lot of the actual kind of advertising was created either out of Dubai or out of Lebanon as well. Actually, kind of at that point, Beirut was more so than a kind of creative hub than maybe it is now. But it meant you got to do some really interesting visits across the whole region.
And was this like an English language publication?
Yeah, correct. It was. Yeah, so predominantly the business language was English, which was lucky because my Arabic was exceptionally poor and even more so as it's lost. But I suppose where it was really useful for me as a journo making the kind of leap towards business was seeing a startup up close. And it's one thing to come along as an editor and see that there's an awards process already in place, and you see that you do the call for entries and people pay to enter and all of those other things, and it just exists. But when you start one yourself and it works, then that sort of just gives you the kind of confidence that later when you do it yourself, then there's kind of something to it.
I guess I'm surprised that there's a large enough marketing industry in the Middle East that also speaks English. That's kind of the astonishing thing for me in hearing this.
Yeah, and I suppose what you would often find is because so much of marketing relates to kind of the global holding companies, so your WPPs, your Omnicoms, your Publicis, etc., they will own local offices, all of those people, of all of those things. And generally the CEO of that office is an English-speaking person. So then the kind of that becomes, I suppose, the language of the business, even if a lot of the advertising they're creating is Arabic language. So you definitely have sort of two tiers. So there were Arabic language specialist publications, trade press publications as well. But broadly, I think the business language of the marketing world globally, which I guess becomes personified when you see everyone turn up at the Cannes Lions in June, is English language.
So that's how you end up in Dubai. But how did you end up in Australia? Was the parent company based in Australia?
Yeah, now the Dubai experience was short. It was less than 2 years, and that was plenty. So it was one of those things. It was kind of I was glad to do it and glad to get back. So I got back to the UK, fully planning that was it for my adventures, and then just happened to have a call from somebody who was publisher of B&T magazine, which is back in the day used to stand for broadcast and television, but by then was a sort of general interest, trade title, who on the grapevine had heard that I was available, and given that most of my stuff was on a boat on the way back from Dubai somewhere, it wasn't that hard to say yes to the Australian experience. So yes, never never having set foot in Australia before, I accepted the job and headed across to Australia rather than starting back in the UK trade press as I'd expected.
And what year was that?
So that was 2006, October 2006. So kind of I guess an optimistic Australia, which had not that long before run its very successful Sydney Olympics, and I think that was the first time I remember seeing the place on television and thinking that looks like somewhere that might be nice to work. And it was just prior to a kind of real boom of people coming in from not just the UK but the US as well into Australia, particularly in specialist agency roles, because it was just sort of prior to the rise of programmatic advertising, where suddenly this was requiring a whole sort of different level of experience.
So 2006 is when you moved to Australia. 2008 is when you launched Mumbrella. I think you had business partners in that. So what was kind of the idea? What was kind of the catalyst? Like, what was the original thing that you were thinking about building?
Yeah, so when I first came to Australia, the person who hired me as publisher was a chap called Martin Lane, who, having accepted the job and put all my life in a suitcase, about 2 or 3 weeks before I started, he kind of emailed me to say, by the way, we won't be working together because I'm leaving. So Martin went off to work at as general manager of a publication called TNT, which was a newsletter for a printed newsletter for backpackers that was distributed in Aussie pubs to catch British backpackers. And alongside Martin, his sort of colleague in that was a chap called Ian Wakeling. And they had ambitions to launch a B2B arm. So they launched, first of all, a small title called Backpacker Trade News. But Martin, after having dragged me across to Australia, stayed in touch and kept nagging me to come and join them and launch something myself with them. So after 2 years at B&T, which was broadly a print-based product with a slight footprint in digital, but not very much, I think I began to kind of read the runes that there wasn't as much appetite within my current employer to do the digital things I wanted to do. So yeah, in the end, kind of made the leap with the decision to go across and launch what became Mumbrella as a rival to the two main existing print titles in the space.
So the two people that you are the two people who were running this backpack, they became partners of yours with what you launched with Mumbrella, right?
Yeah, correct. So I ended up working out of TNT's office, and of course this was a print product, and like all print products, kind of declining. But what that was actually a sort of beautiful kind of incubator model is you're in an existing newsroom with existing facilities. You need a bit of design work, there's someone there. You need some help if in organising an event or something, there's someone there. And gradually many members of that team, as we grew at Mumbrella, began to then come across onto the existing team until, by the end we were occupying most of that space.
Mm-hmm. So with Mumbrella, the original idea was like a PDF newsletter or something like that, right?
That's right. The original dreadful idea was a PDF newsletter. So and there is a tiny bit more logic to that than it sounds. So something I had noticed when I was at B&T was our daily newsletter, which went alongside our weekly print product, was PDF based. Now, I'd thought that was a terrible idea at the time, but the one thing that we did notice was there were advertisers then who were really happy to buy a full page ad in the PDF, who wouldn't necessarily have wanted to buy a medium rec display ad, online display ad. So there was a sort of logic to it. So the thinking of what Mumbrella would become would be a series of really specialist PDF newsletters. So in my thinking, there would be a weekly title for just people working in media agencies, a weekly PDF for just people working in advertising agencies, maybe one for people working media owner side, etc. So the thinking that will be this network of PDFs, and then almost the afterthought was there would be some sort of receptacle where we would put all of this content together under one overarching brand, and that receptacle was Mumbrella. Unfortunately, pragmatic trumped strategic, and when we launched in late 2008, Christmas was coming soon, and there didn't seem much point in starting the advertising conversations and starting launching these publications that side of Christmas. So we started with Mumbrella as a blog on WordPress, and we just picked our moment really well. We not through expertise but through luck. It was just as three things: WordPress became stable. Email became cheap, and social media came through, and Twitter became this great amplifier of the conversation. So just this cheeky little blog really took up and began to kind of very quickly find a place in the conversation around media and marketing.
And so, what did it cover exactly? Was it just Australia media and marketing, or were you doing global media and marketing? What were you kind of writing about?
Yeah, the central focus was always people working in the communications industry in Australia. They were the audience. And of course, what you were looking for was anything that was relevant to them. So an awful lot of that will be things happening in the market, but also obviously you'd want to cover a global story when it was relevant to them, and you'd want to see that through the Australian lens. So the label became, right from the beginning, was everything under the media and marketing umbrella, and the kind of implicit in that was Australia's media and marketing umbrella, and that was also obviously where the brand Mumbrella came from, the M's of media and marketing, along with the word umbrella, which I then remember telling a friend who worked in one of the media agencies about, and being a kind of ad wanker, he was, mum is a really warm word semantically. So that was where the word Mumbrella came from. But yeah, the idea was, if you were somewhere in that communications landscape, this was a place where there was a conversation going on about your industry.
And to start with, was it just you writing for it, or did you have a actual reporting team or anything like that?
Initially, it was just me, just doing some crazy hours as we began to find some momentum. So I would say for probably at least the first year, just me. But I suppose where I benefited from over the years is one of the great things about working on kind of daily papers, and I'd also sort of been sent on attachments to briefly a kind of new news agency being set up as a rival to the Press Association. I got quite used to writing fast, and I guess by then I had enough kind of domain expertise that I was able to kind of know both my subject matter but also what the point of kind of interest or contention was. So I was probably posting at least 7 or 8 pieces a day, some of which though could only be 2 or 3 paragraphs, and other much longer pieces. So you'd sort of you'd sort of create this package, and initially the layout it was the classic WordPress template of The Journalist was the name of the template, but that was one stream. And then as we began to find a bit of momentum, we did our first redesign, which at least created kind of a news stream, a features stream, and a more kind of diary based stream, sort of slightly funnier stuff. But right from the beginning, the kind of secret sauce of it was the comment thread. There was just this really strong, opinionated, sometimes trouble-causing comment thread from the audience that it all kind of came together at that moment.
And how long did it take you to build momentum?
Yeah, look, in terms of editorial momentum, it came along very, very quickly. Within within, if not weeks, then certainly months, it felt like it was a conversation. I remember chatting to the CEO of a media agency, and he kind of said, when I walk around in the office, I can just see it's open on everyone's screens. And so much of that actually was the comments underneath the story, because one of the things about the Australian marketing industry, and particularly kind of the agency side of things, is they're just really horrible people to each other. They're really outspoken, which does make for kind of very outrageous, intriguing comment threads, which I suppose, one of the first kind of transitional moments for us was having to switch to pre from post moderation, just because the defamation risk was getting so high as we began to find the audience. But this, and I suppose it's kind of worth making the point. One of the things that I think got us so much momentum was the two established trade titles, which are, as I say, B&T, where I previously worked, and Ad News, were both broadly still in print. They both still did weekly editions in print, and their daily editions were so edition based. If one or the other of those titles had a really good story, they would just sit on it and not send their day's newsletter until the other one had sent. And they'd get involved in these kind of standoffs where they both go later and later if they both had the same good story. And sometimes it'd be 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon. So we just came through in the middle and we sent our newsletter at lunchtime each day. And it was a good year before either of them reacted to that and started sending it at about the same time. So there was just this gap open for a while that we were lucky enough to jump into.
Yeah, I've interviewed a lot of Australian media entrepreneurs, and it seems like there was like a lag between where the US was and where Australia was, and you could like sort of see trends starting in the US, and you could, if you knew to jump on those trends, like you could be ahead of the curve. Like I interviewed the founder of Mamma Mia. Her name's like Mia Friedman or something. I forget what her full name
Mia
is.
Friedman and her partner Jason Levine run Mamma Mia.
Yeah. So she was like working for traditional women's magazines, but they were very print centric. And then she started Mamma Mia as just like what you did with the blog. And because there was not a single, because all the women's magazines were still had a print mentality, she was able to just kind of run circles around them and scaled up an audience like almost immediately. Whereas like in the US, like a lot of the women's publications had already moved towards publishing more digital stuff. So it's interesting. And Mumbrella, the gossipy comment section stuff reminds me of the early days of Gawker, because Gawker was originally like a Manhattan media gossip blog before it kind of grew its purview and started covering more kind of general news. But that was kind of what it was originally, like that kind of snarky, very, very reliant on its comment section, everything like that. So you started building momentum right away. So like, and it was always like a free publication, right? Like it was advertising supported.
Yeah, correct. Now I suppose one of the wonderful things about being in this media and marketing niche, which does go through even to this day, is there are advertisers who will pay a premium to talk to that audience, because broadly they want to talk to marketers because marketers hold budgets. So that whole sort of trade press advertising side of things broadly revolves around that single point. So for us with Mumbrella back then, it made so much sense to maximize your audience in order to deliver that to the advertisers over any other part of the model. And and the model did kind of gradually grow as we went along, but yeah, it was kind of it was if you had an audience, it was a wonderful niche to be in.
So you were selling like display ads to like tech companies that service marketing firms or something like that, or marketing departments, or what was the kind of clientele?
Some of that, but the primary one was media owners themselves, so media companies. So it would be your In Australia, some of the dominant brands would be News Corp, for instance. So it would be News Corp with a message on your website saying to marketers, you should consider us as your advertising option. It was versions of that. But obviously, as the tech companies came through as well, then yes, you absolutely did get your sort of your Googles or your Facebooks, etc., as advertisers too. But an awful lot of it is as it is in kind of still in many markets, including the US and the UK. There are media owners who want to promote their wares to media agencies and marketers, and use the trade media to do that.
Interesting. I've never seen that, where that, like, because you think of like media companies not having a lot of money that they would spend just to try to lure advertisers and marketers to spend money on theirs. So it's interesting.
I suppose one of the ways of thinking about it is if you're say a TV network, in Australia there are three dominant TV networks: there's 7, 9, and 10, and if they can shift 1% of their share across from another one, then that is many millions of dollars in difference. So of course, they'll do things like the upfronts, but the other way is through having a kind of trade press strategy.
Mm-hmm. So you eventually get into events, right? And that was eventually end up being like one of your more lucrative revenue models.
Yeah, that's right. So we started with small sort of niche events, but I guess they were always about building the community in some way. So they started off literally with, Mumbrella question time, which would be you'd sell tickets for maybe a couple $100. It'd be breakfast at a venue, and then on stage I'd moderate a conversation with 4 or 5 kind of experts. So you'd probably have a marketer on stage, someone from a media agency, someone from an advertising agency, and maybe someone from a media company. And you just, talk about the topics of the day, you take some questions from the audience, and it would wrap up in, an hour and a half. And as well as kind of the revenue from tickets, you'd probably have a sponsor on board as well. So that was where we were sort of beginning to kind of monetize that. And then we probably really went through sort of 2 phases that really helped us round out the event side of things. One was in 2011, we launched an event called Mumbrella 360. And the idea was this would be a conference for anyone working in the communications industry. The thinking would be it would be big enough and broad enough that if you bought a ticket, there will be something going on so that will be relevant to you. So multiple stages across 2, in fact, I think even from the first year, 2.5 days. And again, we managed to just sort of build some momentum. So now in the in the US, you already had events like Advertising Week who did something very similar. But again, there was nothing quite like that in the market. We really leaned heavily into involving our own community in the kind of the curation of it. So, we invited people to propose sessions, and we just had a huge response. It was probably at least 100 proposals or something like that. And again, one of the things we did, and it was clumsy, but we actually published all of the proposals and invited people to vote on which ones they wanted to hear. And
that's what South by Southwest does here now.
Yes, here. Exactly. Yeah, and very possibly they did it even then as well. And the thing was, it was so clumsily presented on our part that I suspect there were very few readers who actually did wade their way through the probably 200,000 words worth of proposals. But it was a really great proof point that the audience was getting behind it. And then, of course, people go where the market is. So sponsors began to come on board because they could see it had momentum, and then people sort of became intrigued. We always had a kind of policy being really generous with tickets for anyone. So if you actually had proposed a session, it got up, then of course you had a ticket to the whole conference, and you actually then got to give some more tickets to your speakers and all of those things. So it just meant that by the time we it had numbers and was going to become self-fulfilling. So we only launched it in January 2011. We put our first call out, and we ran it in June 2011, which is just insane. If I'd known then what I know now, I never would have done it, because of course this was an incredibly small team still at this point, because we were still only about 3 years old. We were a really small team. I was still trying to publish multiple pieces every day, whilst also directly curating this whole conference as well. But it was all about getting to the first year as a success and then building from there, which is what we did. So we took over 2 floors of the Hilton. We had, I imagine, maybe 2,000 people through the doors for the first one, and very kind of organically, it worked, and it kind of, the buzz and the quality of the speakers were enough that we had even more demand for people to come along next time around.
Interesting. So that became like an annual conference, like big conference that you did?
Yeah, so Mumbrella 360 became our big annual kind of generalist conference. And then the second part of where the business model really began to add up for, I suppose, was we grew as a business. There was myself and Martin Lang kind of active in the day-to-day, and then Ian Wakeling as a third partner was more of an investor. He wasn't involved in the day-to-day, but we kind of realised that we were both journos by background who'd sort of accidentally ended up running this media business. So we got some help from a chap called Tony Fore, who these days you'll find on various kind of the Australian stock exchanges, the ASX. So he's chair of a few ASX businesses. But he began to come in and advise us 2 half days per week. And it was really about, his mantra was repeatable processes, but building some structure behind things. So he would work with our sales team for half a day a week, and then sort of with Martin and I on the running of the business on the other half day. And we began to figure out actually if we could create events which followed the same template but served different niches, then we would just be able to execute so much more. So we began to do sort of marketing summits in specific niches. So the travel marketing summit was our first one. Then you do the financial marketing summit, the automotive marketing summit. And by the end, we had 5 or 6 sort of niche automotive marketing summits, of which it was a really beautiful model, because there was a very definable group of people who would want to come along and buy tickets. And there was a very definable group of potential sponsors who, if there's going to be one event they sponsored that year to speak to that audience, that would be the one. So that sort of really began to round out the kind of the conference side of the business for us, I suppose.
Yeah, it's interesting. I always think of Australia as just like such a smaller population than the US. It's like, what, 30 million people?
Yeah, that would be about right. Yes, so we are small. It's like, it's always kind of said about Australia, you can support about 2.5 things of most things. So 2.5 supermarket chains, 2.5 airlines. So yes, and I think the way we made that and your observation is absolutely right. I think the way we made that work in Australia is, if you look at somewhere like the US or even the UK, you have a specialist title for people working in advertising agencies, a specialist title for people working in PR, and so on. Whereas Mumbrella, because we kind of conglomerated it all together under one umbrella, that made our addressable market just small enough that we could still manage to talk to it as one market, but also just big enough it became a market that we could actually have a trading relationship with that worked.
Yeah, I guess I'm surprised there was a large enough of like a, for instance, like travel marketing industry that they could like support its own conference or something. You know what I mean?
Yes, and you're probably talking about 200 people in the room on the day. but that's enough to work on that sort of on that scale.
So at its peak, I think you've told me that it was generating like $7 million a year. What was that like split between events and then just advertising on the website?
Yeah, it was. I mean, the main sources of revenue were events, and of course, the beauty of those is that can involve both tickets and sponsorship. Now, separate to that, then to that sponsorship, you then have on the publishing side of things, you have advertising. Now, often it's the very same people who might be sponsoring an event are also the potential advertisers. But sometimes they've just got a bit of a different sort of strategy for going slightly more broad, and that would be advertising both on the daily email newsletter, but also on the website itself. Through the sort of some sort of classic CPM model. Although we never did programmatic. It was always we always traded it directly, which because programmatic you might get $1 or $2 CPM, whereas we would confidently ask for $50 or $70 CPM because of the quality of the audience that we were delivering. And then the other part was it was smaller, but there was a paid sort of information tier where we created a directory of which brands worked with which agencies. So say you worked in media sales and you wanted to pitch a particular campaign to a particular telco, you'd want to see which media agency you should be talking to. So that became a subscription product, which we never quite got there with. It's sort of but the things I hate, and there were plenty of things that we executed badly, and never knew if it was strategically the right thing or not. And that's a good example of that, I think, where I think probably it was more executional rather than strategic, why they didn't quite take off.
And when did you decide to sell the company?
Yeah, it was something of an organic conversation. So as I say, there was sort of Martin and myself involved in the day-to-day. Then Ian Wakeling, as the third partner, had been a very patient man. In that he'd not been taking a salary or dividends from the company. So we began to look for an exit for him, which I suppose it was probably about 2016, late 2016, that process would have started. So we engaged somebody to run that process for us, to create a full detailed information memorandum, and really kind of create a good kind of data package. And we were kind of agnostic about what that would mean for Martin and I. We were open to retaining ownership ourselves whilst finding an exit for Ian. But in the end, the kind of the proposals that came in sort of were much more structured around a route to us all making a full kind of ownership exit. And also, I think Martin and I would both, I think, tell you the same thing, that we'd probably, as our own working relationship, we were beginning to run our own race on that as well. That probably had a bit of a kind of end date coming up where at some point we were going to need to go in different directions.
And so who did you end up selling it to?
So we ended up selling to a US-based company, Diversified, who are broadly now in the expo space. They're based in Maine, but not the cool Maine, and they're also, amongst other places, in the UK and Australia, around the world, mainly in expos. But I think they had an interest in kind of adding other strings to the bow. So they became the acquirer in late 2017.
So they're a live events company. So they were, even though they were probably interested in the media arm, they were probably, first became interested because of your event.
Yeah, look, I think that's true. Although it's sort of, I guess the funny thing about kind of Mumbrella was, we always talked about doing an expo, but we never did. So that was the one thing we didn't offer as part of it. But yeah, definitely one of the attractions in that part of the world they would have understood would have been the events side of things.
And when did that sale happen?
So that happened in December 2017 with a sort of 2-year lock-in for myself and Martin.
2-year lock-in to work there or 2-year non-compete?
2-year lock-in to work there, 4-year non-compete.
4-year non-compete. So when did your non-compete run up?
So our non-compete ran out in very late 2001, but our earn-out...
Not 21. 2021, you mean?
Sorry, lock-in period ended after 2 years. So that was very early in 2020. And then our non-compete ended at the end of 2021. 2021.
So you went on and you launched another brand called Unmade. And it's in the same vertical, right? Like it's covering like media and stuff like that. Is it still kind of Australian media?
Yeah, broadly. Yeah, so the way that came about was I had some family reasons why I expected to be committed to being in the UK for a number of years, which was something I'd shared with our new owners. So we were hopeful I might be in a position to stay on board and do something from the UK, but 2020 came along, and the best laid plans meant that the appetite to do something new in the UK didn't happen. So Unmade was initially, it was really my way of staying in touch with the Australian industry for when I came back. So in part of 2020, I'd taken long service leave, in which I'd written a book, which was called Media Unmade, and it was about the sort of history of Australia's media from 2010 to about 2020, and sort of telling the story of how it had got to where we were at that point. So my thinking was, by the time I came back to Australia in maybe 2025 or something, I'd want to find ways of staying in touch. So Unmade became sort of a London-based publication for an Australian audience, where I thought, okay, I'll try and lean into being in the other hemisphere, being in the other time zone, covering the interesting global things that have happened overnight for an Australian audience. But then it so happened that my personal circumstances changed again, so I ended up coming back to Australia sooner than expected, which has probably, in all honesty, kind of accelerated the kind of the business side of the publication faster than I would have expected.
Mm-hmm. So you come back so you launched Unmade prior to you moving back to Australia?
Correct. Yes. So
and I was surprised to see it was a Substack newsletter, because like, given that you were an experienced media entrepreneur that built up like a multi-million-dollar media company, usually that kind of mature of a media entrepreneur, they'll go with like a custom website, at least WordPress, and like a little bit more customized. They usually like Substack is a good kind of starter media outlet for people who are just like solo entrepreneurs who are just trying to get like an MVP up. But you decided to do Substack?
Yeah, so I decided to do Substack. I was super interested anyway. It was just at that moment where people were beginning to talk about it, and Substack also made it financially worth my while to do that. So I was very fortunate that I'd knew a little bit through having previously interviewed Hamish McKenzie, one of the co-founders of Substack. So at the time, Substack were funding a few journalists, mostly in the US.
Yeah, this was Substack Pro. Yeah,
correct. Yeah, so just as I think the boom gates were coming down on Substack Pro, I just managed to sneak in before the boom gates closed, and they effectively funded our first year, which, and the kind of and the deal of that really is that if you're going to do that, then you have to be cool with not carrying ads on your Substack during that time, because of course they predominantly see the world as a subscription world, whereas I just happen to be in a niche where there are more advertising dollars than most. But I was very comfortable to do that deal because, of course, what you actually want to do is to build up an audience before you monetize your advertising. So it was so effectively having, Substack sort of back us for that first year where we were finding our feet and finding an audience. Really did make it a lot easier to kind of sort of, I guess, go it alone. So it never felt like a compromise for doing Substack. And I think the other thing as well is there is something slightly different about email first. It feels a bit more like you are writing a letter to your reader in some way. And and the time will come fairly soon, I think, where we're not email first, but kind of having a point of difference for what's a very crowded local market of being email first was another reason for doing it.
And so you've now launched a media company in 2008 and then the early 2020s. Obviously there are a lot of differences in the sense that you had experience. You probably you already had existing contacts. You probably had, you had an already existing brand, so you had a little bit of a leg up there. But like, what does it feel like the biggest difference was in terms of the, those two media ecosystems that you launched into?
Honestly, and I love listening to your podcast, but the thing I always most enjoy are whether people admit to the stuff they find hard. And for me, I would say that this time round I've been flapping my wings twice as hard and it's gone half as fast. So we are moving forward, but I don't think I appreciated last time around how much those wins were behind us, as I say.
Yeah, and that kind of goes back to what I was talking about with the Mamma Mia thing of like you were publishing into an information vacuum back then where you literally had no competition. But now you're launching into an ultra saturated media market of not just newsletters, websites, TikTokers, Instagram accounts, YouTubers. Like you were just like competing with not just content with your niche, but just people's time for content in general. It is just like a completely different attention span that you're dealing with now.
Yeah, absolutely. So you have to find a different niche. So I think for, whereas last time round, the thing about Mumbrella was it was trying to be everything for everybody. Whereas this time, I suppose, where I sort of try to lean into, I guess my greatest asset now is being one of the more experienced journalists in the market. I as I say, I've been covering the Australian market for nearly 18 years, but writing about media and marketing for more than 20. So that places me better than most to actually be able to give the context side of things to the audience. So my niche now is much more about one or two pieces a day, which are at the most, which are more detailed, much more about that third paragraph explaining why, rather than every single press release that comes through. So our differentiator in a kind of crowded trade press is you may find 5 of them carrying exactly the same story, but we will hopefully be the only place where you'll read something kind of original and different. So that is broadly where we're beginning to, and we're not quite 3 years. It'll be our 3-year anniversary in August, so depending when this goes up, we might not be quite there, or we might be there. So we're still only finding our feet at the moment, but where we're developing a niche is around a reputation for analysis that you can't read elsewhere on the day.
So for that contract you signed with Substack, I know of other writers that signed it. It basically says you can't have any advertising in the newsletter for the year, and then once that year is up, it reverts back to you, and you can basically, it goes back to the 90-10 split for the subscriptions, and then you can basically do whatever you want with your newsletter. So now that has expired, what's kind of your business model mix now?
Yeah, so you're right. That expired. So and you've got that exactly right. It was one year, and we'll always be grateful for Substack for giving us that start. So stage one of the process was we de-risked it slightly when we launched advertising by outsourcing it to a media sales house. So that model where you pay them a retainer, a monthly retainer, and then a probably slightly higher percentage commission than you would pay to a member of staff. So that has got us through the next 2 years of that process, and literally at the point at which we're recording this. So 2 or 3 days ago, since we recorded this, we've appointed our first kind of person to lead sales in-house. So this person will have the title of partnership director, and that kind of, I guess, is a sort of sign of the fact that we've grown over that 2 years of outsourced sales, and it's time to see how far we can go by bringing it in-house.
And is it the same kind of sponsor you had for Mumbrella, or is it a different mix now?
Yeah, look, the Australian financial year ends in June, so I've got a reasonably good set of data at the moment. So breaking down our revenues for the last financial year, which ended about a month ago. So paid subs 18%, advertising on the newsletter 47%, sponsorship of our events 17%, and event tickets 20%. So in other words, the publishing arm is about 2/3 at the moment, and the event arm is about 1/3, give or take. Or actually, no, maybe call it 60-40.
But who are the sponsors? Like, is it the same folks that were sponsoring you back in 2008? Like the same kind of brands and stuff like that?
Very broadly, yes. Like the type of sponsor is probably the same. The brands might have changed.
Mm-hmm. And how big is your staff now?
So staff is still pretty small. So we have a chief of staff, and that's a sort of not the journalistic tradition of chief of staff. This is the person who sort of leads our operational side of things. So she at the moment works half time. We have a head of the person who leads the curation side of our events. So putting together the programs, which I view very much as a journalistic role, and she also, until the week we're speaking, has been half-time, but she's about to step up to full-time. As I say, we have just hired, and he starts the week after we start speaking, as a full-time person, a full-time title is head of partnerships, but person to lead the sales. And then we're currently carrying a vacancy for a second journo in addition to myself, which we'll refill at some point in the coming months. But it sort of means that most of my day, certainly my working hours day at the moment, is still involved in writing.
And I see you have a fancy mic there. Are you doing like podcasting or any other kind of multimedia type stuff?
Yeah, we do 2 podcasts a week. So at 8 a.m. on a Monday, we record one called Start the Week, which is, it's literally attempting to be an agenda starter for the week. It's a conversation about key topics that have maybe broken in that day's newspapers, because they tend to all have their media and marketing sections on a Monday. So it's sort of reacting to that, looking in the diary, and that's co-presented by myself and Abe Udy, who owns a audio editing company called Abe's Audio, and they're based here in Australia. They're one of the kind of sort of major kind of voiceover and audio editing companies. So they provide those services. And then on a Thursday, our other podcast is more interview based. So it will generally be a conversation with somebody who's in some way a player in this media and marketing world.
And so, like, what is your ambition? Is this like, are you just running the playbook for Mumbrella again, just kind of build it up to, X million in revenue and then sell it again? Like, what do you want to be doing in 5 years?
Look, I think the thing that always left me a bit conflicted about Mumbrella was selling before I could quite see how far we could go. And I suppose also there's also the challenge that this time round, I feel terribly fraudulent, but somewhere on my LinkedIn profile the word says CEO and publisher, and it always feels really fraudulent to have the word CEO against a business that employs just 4 or 5 people. But last time round, I was obviously, I could, contributed to strategy, and I wore a hat as a company director and as a shareholder, etc. But my colleague Martin was the CEO, so I'd like to find out for myself if actually I can run a media business myself as well. But the big conflict with that one is that the thing I actually love doing still is the writing. So I think I'm an adequate publisher, and my real domain expertise is on the writing about this particular industry. So it's about getting to enough scale, I think, where I can hand over to the experts to do the things that experts will be better than me at. And we're still super early in that, in that process, because we're in the, our revenue is in the very low hundreds of thousands of dollars at the moment. It's certainly not in the millions yet.
Okay, Tim, those are all the questions I have for you. Where can people find you online?
You can find me, if you want to email me, tim@unmade.media. Or if you'd like to have a look at what we write about, unmade.media.
All right. Well, this is a lot of fun. Thanks for joining me.
Simon, thank you so much for the invitation.